The next thing I knew, I was picking myself up off the floor, in a great deal of pain. "Nick, buddy, thanks for breaking my fall." "Don't mention it." I grimaced, massaging the lump that was sprouting on the top of my head. Although we couldn't see any of the babies, we knew they were lurking nearby. Carefully, nervously, we followed Philippe up the stairs toward the nearest set of doors to the lobby. He reached into his flak jacket and nonchalantly pulled out a second machine gun. Doubly armed, he led the way through the short tunnel and into the lobby. As we feared, there was a welcoming committee waiting to greet us. Only 30 yards to our left, a pack of baby Godzillas, perhaps a dozen strong, stood there licking their chops. Drawn by the fishy scent of our flesh, they dipped their long necks close to the ground and began to advance. "This way," Philippe shouted, setting off at an easy jog. As we began to run, the lizard's predatory instincts kicked in, and they gave chase. Philippe surveyed the curving foyer and pointed to a set of escalators up ahead. I was running on pure survival instinct. I don't even remember seeing the bank of coin-operated candy dispensers along the wall. I just remember reaching out with both hands and desperately trying to throw some obstacle into the path. When the machines tipped over and hit the floor, all the glass shattered and thousands upon thousands of jawbreakers and gumballs spread out across the hard floor. When the baby Godzilla stepped on them, all their feet went out from under them. When we got to the top of the escalator, we didn't head down the stairs. It was the sheer number of baby Godzillas crowded onto the floor below that caused us to stop running. None of them looked up at first, but they smelled us almost immediately. The ones closest to us twitched their nostrils, then searched with their eyes until they found us. Within seconds, every lizard in the lobby stopped what it was doing and whipped around to look at us. And everything became deathly quiet. "How much time do we have left?" Audrey whispered. I checked my watch. Less than 30 seconds. The hunting party came marching carefully toward us. We all stared across the room at the exit doors. To reach them, we would have to wade into the lake of lizards. Philippe glanced over his shoulder at us and asked, "Well, what are we waiting for? Let's go." He started down the escalator as casually as if he were trotting off to visit the men's room. And because we didn't know what else to do, we followed him. Halfway down the steps, he raised both his machine guns and fired a short blast of ammunition toward the ceiling. The bullets sliced through the cables supporting the closest of the huge chandeliers. In a blur of crystal and iron, the lighting fixtures plummeted earthward and shattered on the floor with a violent crash. The startled lizards darted to the sides of the room. It was all the opening we needed. We raced away from the bottom step and out into the lobby, moving in a line. The animals quickly recovered from their initial fright and rushed towards us in a ferocious shoulder-to-shoulder wave. Philippe's guns blazed again, and the second chandelier exploded in the center of the floor. Again, the animals shied away from the noise and flying debris, but not nearly as far as the first time.
Santa Claus on a fire truck.
Animal and Audrey reached the doors first and got them to open. I dashed outside where it was still raining. Rocher followed me, and we slammed the doors closed. All four of us wedged our bodies against the doors and somehow managed to withstand the lizard's initial shoulder-crunching onslaught.
Let me see here.
They surged against the doors, pushing with ever greater force. We grunted and shoved and used all our strength to keep the doors closed. The lizards began headbutting the inside of the doors, forcing them open a few inches at a time. Then the glass broke.
Alrighty, buddy.
Jaws opened over Audrey's head. She ducked at the last minute, just as Philippe got the gun wedged into the handles of the doors. As we backed away, the gun barrel began to bend out of shape. The metal wasn't strong enough to hold the rambunctious youngsters back for long, but we hoped it would be long enough. The radio on Philippe's belt began functioning once we were out in the open again. We heard the military pilot speaking back and forth. Stallion 15, Fox 6, we are targeted and locked. Roger that, fire at will. Roger that, missiles are away. Run, I yelled. We were almost to a totally deserted stretch of 7th Avenue when the missiles flashed past overhead, streaking in the opposite direction. We heard the missiles penetrate the roof of the world's best-known sports arena. We were halfway across the boulevard when the building blew to smithereens behind us. The force of the blast hit us before the sound reached our ears. The blast picked all of us up. Landing was painful. I turned back and looked at the mountain of flame coming from the hole in the ground that had been Gojira's nest.
So, Angela, how you
As the
doing?
remaining
Okay?
chunks of wall crumbled and collapsed, a gruesome noise filled the air. The painful screams of young lizards roasting alive. Slowly, the pitiful sound died away, and all was silent, except for the crackle of the flames
That's something for
and the
Clint.
pattering of the rain.
Ah.
I sat up and checked to see if Audrey was hurt. "Are you okay?" I asked her. She said she was fine. "Odd, you look a little funny. Are you sure you're all right?" "No, I'm fine. It's just that I never imagined your life was this exciting." "Oh, you'd be surprised," I told her. "Nick, I'd like to find out." She leaned in, bringing that angelic face of hers closer and closer to mine. She then kissed me. With a great deal of moaning and groaning, Animal scraped himself off the pavement, but he forgot his own pain when he saw his video camera lying in the street. Like a mother concerned for her injured baby, he ran over and scooped the machine up in his arms. Part of the plastic housing had broken off, but the camera was still working. The wily undercover agent forced his battered body into a sitting position. A drip of blood rolled down the side of his face from a fresh raspberry abrasion above his left eye. The radio on Philippe's belt continued to pick up the Army's secure communications. As we watched Madison Square Garden burn down to a huge, glowing bowl in the earth, we kept one ear tuned to the radio. The mangled corpses of baby Godzillas lay in the street, strewn around the gigantic fire pit. "Hey, man," Animal said to Philippe. "You all right?" "I could use a coffee." It wasn't long before we heard that famous wailing cry. We knew in a heartbeat that Gojira was still alive. But the sound was muffled and seemed to come from far away. It echoed in all directions around the deserted city. Only when the ground began to shake more violently did we realize that he was below us, using the subway system again to move underground. We turned toward the smoking lava pit that had been Madison Square Garden, and saw something begin to stir the pot of glowing embers. Chunks of burning debris were thrown high in the air as a huge shape thrashed around in the crater. Then a huge gray head with piercing amber eyes burst out of the smoldering wreckage. In one fluid motion, he climbed up out of Penn Station into the burning garden and lifted his torso and long neck several stories into the air. Great cascades of blood poured down his flanks and dripped into the pavement as he lumbered up onto the street and towered over us. The Navy's torpedoes had sheared away large patches of his scale armor, and he stood above us war-torn. He bent down and nuzzled gently at something on the ground, in one place after another, becoming more agitated all the while. We realized what he was doing, inspecting the burned and battered bodies of his children, looking desperately for one of them to show a sign of life, but they were all as dead as could be. When he understood this, he arched his back, threw his neck back, and howled into the sky. This time, the scream was different. It sounded like a cry of suffering. The titanic lizard wheeled its great head in our direction and glared down at us with those burning honey-brown eyes. His tail began to lash back and forth, and his fleshless lips peeled back to reveal the ragged teeth set in his glistening pink gums. "What do we do now?" Animal asked. "Running would be a good idea," I replied. We scrambled into a nearby alley, only a moment before the enraged creature pounced in our direction. Before we got very far, he began bulldozing his way towards us. Philippe called to us and waved us into a narrow space between two adjoining buildings. We made it into this narrow passageway only a moment before a huge clawed foot smashed down in the alleyway behind us. I threw a glance over my shoulder and saw that Gojira had gotten himself temporarily stuck, his body far too wide for the narrow alley. We ran between the buildings until we came out into another street. Desperately, I searched everywhere for signs of the military, but the street showed no signs of activity. Philippe bolted across the street and yanked open the door of an abandoned yellow cab. In a blur of movement, he hot-wired the car. We followed him across the street and started piling into the cab. We weren't completely inside when the engine turned over and Agent Rocher put the pedal to the metal. Unfortunately, our escape route was blocked by the sudden appearance of a giant, three-toed foot that spread across two of the street's 4 lanes. The view out the front windshield became one big toenail, and the next thing we knew we were moving upward. The curved claw formed a ramp that sent us airborne, flying 10 feet into the air. The vehicle bottomed out hard when we landed on the other side of the foot. I don't think Philippe so much as blinked. He gunned the engine once more and accelerated up the street as the creature roared in frustration. I buckled my seatbelt just before Philippe hit the brakes and swerved around a corner. Even though I knew I wouldn't like what I saw, I spun around to look out the back window. The window filled with nostrils and teeth as Gojira snapped at us. Philippe immediately swung the taxi into a long, skidding turn before blasting off once more in the direction we'd come from. Finally, military backup arrived. A small convoy of Humvees, the vehicles sent out to search for us and bring us back to New Jersey, rolled into the intersection ahead of us. At the time, Philippe had the cab moving at about 90 miles per hour and was still accelerating. The driver of the lead Humvee slammed on his brakes to avoid plowing into us. The vehicles behind him reacted too late, and they piled up like dominoes in a chain reaction crash. I caught a glimpse of Sergeant O'Neill sitting inside the lead vehicle. I spun around to look out the rear window. The lizard, still pursuing us, came through the intersection a second after we'd shot past, and stepped down on the front bumper of O'Neill's vehicle, flattening it. I turned to Philippe. "That was O'Neill. I know him. Turn back." Perhaps he sensed I knew what I was doing. Philippe tapped down on the brake pedal with the precise amount of force necessary to send the cab into a graceful 180-degree slide. "I hope you know what you are doing," he said without taking his eyes off the 400-foot-tall lizard flailing toward us down the boulevard. Actually, I knew exactly what I was doing. Every taxicab in New York City has its own radio frequency. Once O'Neill had our cab's call numbers, it would be a simple matter of finding the company's headquarters, breaking in, locating the vehicle roster, adjusting the bandwidth setting on the radio, and speaking into the microphone. So you see, I knew what I was doing. I just had no idea whether there would be time. Like a professional stunt driver, Agent Rocher swerved his way between the Leviathan's grasping fingers, raced past his hind legs, and narrowly avoided a swipe of the tail. As we flashed into the intersection and swerved around the squash nose of his Humvee, O'Neill and his men scattered in all directions for cover. I leaned as far out the window as I dared and tossed the cab's ID plate onto the street. A second later, Gojira followed us past the spot, this time stepping on the back half of O'Neill's car. When we'd driven a couple of miles without catching sight of our nemesis, we slowed down to about 70 miles per hour. Although I'm not superstitious, I cringed and tried not to listen when Animal looked out the back window and announced, "Hey, I think you lost him." The rest of us moaned, fearing that Animal had just given the beast his cue to come back on stage. And indeed, the creature stepped out from between a pair of buildings several blocks in front of us. We were between blocks and hemmed in by skyscrapers on either side. Rather than speeding forward to the next corner, Philippe brought the cab to a gradual halt. He shifted into reverse, but didn't back up just yet. As we idled in the middle of the avenue, we looked ahead and saw the lizard lower himself to his forepaws and settle into a crouch. He sucked in a long drink of oxygen, his flanks ballooning outward, then exhaled. He forced the air out of his lungs with all his strength, sending a tornado-force blast of power breath in our direction. This foul-smelling wind lifted cars into the air, bent street signs back and shattered all the plate glass windows. The whole swirling mess blew toward us. A newspaper vending machine tore free of the sidewalk and smashed down on the hood of the cab. Philippe gunned the motor and we rocketed backwards, avoiding the worst of the airborne debris. Shifting on the fly, he ground the gears into drive and squealed into another narrow alleyway. Our path was cluttered with dumpsters, cardboard boxes, locked chain-link fences, and all manner of large, impassable obstacles. Obviously, we were trapped. I was already deciding which way to run when Philippe stopped the car, but he showed no signs of pulling over. In fact, he accelerated and blasted his way through one barrier after another. "This time I'm pretty sure we lost him," Animal chirped in. "Shut up!" we all screamed at once. Murphy's Law asserted itself once more, and the creature, walking erect this time, leapt into the intersection behind us. He sucked another storm into his lungs, then unleashed it in our direction. This time, his power breath was strong enough to tear big chunks of asphalt right off the street. We felt the wind lifting the rear of our cab into the air as Philippe jerked the steering wheel violently to the right and sent us sliding around another corner. But I looked behind and saw Gojira was gaining on us. I glanced over at Philippe, wondering what new surprise he would pull out of his bag of tricks to save us this time. But he had his eyes locked on the rearview mirror, and for the first time, I noticed him sweating. I knew I'd better do something and do it fast. "In there!" I yelled. "Go into that tunnel!" We were coming up on a construction site of some sort. Philippe reacted at once, veering over mounds of loose earth and crashing through barricades. We shot up the entrance ramp and into the tunnel just before a set of 6-foot-long claws stabbed through the night and sank into the pavement. Almost as soon as we were inside, we screeched to a halt. The inside of the tunnel was packed with bulldozers and other equipment. This time there would be no driving right through it. Philippe deftly flipped the car around in another 180-degree skid. Just outside, 500 tons of enraged lizard was throwing a monumental temper tantrum. He knew he had us trapped. He let loose several of those trumpeting shrieks and dug great heaps of earth away from the entrance with his foreclaws. Every few seconds the claw disappeared from our view, only to be replaced a second later by a gigantic eye, burning bright with hate. We were in big trouble. "Turn out the headlights," I said to Philippe, thinking out loud. He did, and we were plunged into darkness. My companions made a series of moaning noises to express their displeasure with how things were going. but at least for the time being we were safe. Every time the creature moved away from the mouth of the tunnel, enough light filtered in to allow us to see one another. But I, for one, kept my eyes on him. The cab's radio crackled to life. Nick, can you hear me? I groped around the dashboard until I found the radio. O'Neill, is that you? That was a pretty nice trick with the cab ID. I'm sitting in the office of the cab company right now. Where are you? We're in the Park Avenue Midtown Tunnel, and he's got us pinned down in here. Suddenly, the cab started to move. The lizard had hyperextended one of his long arms, and his claws were scraping against the front bumper and hood. Philippe threw the car into reverse and sent us plowing 15 feet backwards, through whatever machinery or equipment lay behind us. Nick, are you still there? Yes, we're here. Listen, you guys have to lure him out into the open. Somewhere we can get a clear shot at him, maybe take him into Central Park, or out onto the FDR Drive. You think you can do that? Philippe and O'Neill answered my question in stereo. The F-18s can't get a good look at him unless he's out in plain sight. I came up with another idea. Where's the nearest suspension bridge? Brooklyn, Audrey said. I explained what I was thinking to O'Neill and asked him if that would work. He responded that if it worked, my stratagem would be super duper. Does this cab have high beams? I asked. Without another word, Philippe adopted my plan and gunned the engine. The cab peeled out, and we shot forward through the darkness. 20, 40, 60 miles per hour. We were driving blind on a collision course with the creature's head. When he sensed that a head-on collision was imminent, he switched on the brights. I reached over and held down on the horn. Startled by the sudden noise and light, he flinched. He pulled his head away from the tunnel just enough to allow us to blast like a cannonball out of the entrance. We flew, literally, over a ramp and bottomed out again in the dirt of the construction site, skidding sideways. This slowed our forward momentum to a tire-spinning crawl. Gojira spun around, and his huge hands began feeling for us on the ground. The tires eventually found some traction, and we got out, onto the pavement once again. We had been moving south, with no sign of our pursuer for a couple of minutes, when Philippe caught a glimpse of him. Philippe eased off the gas and turned into a side street. In an exhibition of superior driving skill, he took us on an evasive, zigzagging route through the East Village, Little Italy and Chinatown. I had no idea where we were when he doused the headlights and rolled up to a deserted intersection. The coast looked clear, not a saurian in sight. We rolled down all the windows and listened for the sound of smashing buildings, but couldn't hear anything louder than the rain and the hissing of our leaking radiator. Audrey pointed out a brightly lit road sign with a big arrow looming in the distance and read it to us. Brooklyn Bridge that-a-way. The green, brightly illuminated sign was set on an elevated roadway, the bridge's long entrance ramp. We edged out into the intersection, close to Pace University, and saw the first of the bridge's twin Gothic towers rising into the sky. One thing was clear. As soon as we got onto the ramp, we'd be out in the open again, completely exposed. Making matters worse, the half-mile path had tall buildings on both sides. Even though they were set back from the road, we knew the beast could be lurking behind any one of them, waiting to pounce on us when we drove by. Philippe took off. He pulled onto the ramp, pointed the nose of the car down the center of the roadway, and smashed down on the accelerator. Now nothing stood between us and the bridge. We were fast approaching the huge sign that we'd seen before, and looking out the windows for any sign of him when the road in front of us cracked apart and lifted upward. The huge section of the ramp lifted into the air and broke apart. Gojira's enormous head erupted from below, using the flat, bony part of his skull to crash through the pavement. Where there had been 3 lanes of asphalt, there was suddenly nothing but quivering snout and jagged yellow teeth. The beast unhinged his great jaws and waited for us to drive inside. Philippe managed to lock up the brakes and whip us around into yet another perfect 180. He pounded the gas pedal and the tires spun and squealed. We weren't moving. A cloud of choking smoke surrounded the rear of the vehicle, burning rubber. It took us a moment to realize the creature had taken a quick bite out of the ramp, which punctured the taxi's trunk, pinning us to the roadway. Everybody screamed. The teeth lifted out of the trunk, and the cab squirted free once more. Philippe had never lifted his foot off the accelerator, so we whiplashed forward immediately. But we didn't get very far. The roof of the creature's mouth was suddenly above us, and craggy yellow teeth bit down, lowering in front of us like the closing gates of hell. "We're in his mouth!" animals started yelling. "We're in his mouth!" The mouth couldn't close completely because he'd also bitten down on the metal road sign. But as the powerful jaw muscles flexed, all the light bulbs on the sign exploded, and the metal began to bend. The roof of the taxicab began collapsing on top
How
of us.
you doing, Angela?
The cab started shaking from side to side in a violent manner. The road beneath the car was still anchored to the ramp, which temporarily prevented his tongue from shoveling us backwards into the gaping red hole of his throat. We got a lucky break when the sturdy road sign next to us refused to collapse any farther. It stabbed into the roof of his mouth, preventing him from flattening the car any further. As the concrete and asphalt fell away, we saw there were hundreds of steel reinforcing rods laced through the structure. The reason we were shaking was that Gojira was trying to tear the entire section of roadway out of the ground. This he could have accomplished easily, except that he seemed unwilling to open his mouth even for a second. The reinforcing rods anchoring us to the earth began to snap, one by one. Gojira had pulled them taut, and they twanged like guitar strings when they broke. I realized we were only seconds away from a slide down the wet hole of his esophagus. I slithered into a sitting position with my elbows rested on the roof of the cab. My head banged against the rigid upper palate of Gojira's mouth as I struggled to maintain my balance. A loose cable swiped right past my nose and struck the metal sign, sending sparks everywhere. I lunged across the top of the cab and somehow managed to grab a hold of the insulated part of the wire. I immediately jabbed the exposed tip of it into the gummy, pink flesh where tooth met gum. The electrical surge shot through the lizard's body. Reflexively, he jerked backwards with enough force to snap all the remaining cables. As he threw his head to the side, we felt ourselves whip around 180 degrees at spine-snapping velocity. The huge mouth opened and was flooded with the lights coming off the bridge. Gojira had spun himself completely around and put his head close to the ground, trying to cough us up. The bridge was right in front of us. As soon as the wall of teeth lifted out of our way, the battered taxicab lurched forward with me still dangling halfway out the window. The 30-foot section of pavement acted as a natural launch ramp. We shot out of the lizard's mouth. We flew, but not far. Philippe was racing us across the bridge, speeding toward the first tower. It may help if I describe the bridge for those who haven't seen it. First, it's a suspension bridge, rather like the Golden Gate. From end to end, it is just over a mile long, but the part overhanging the river is only half that. Twin Gothic towers, built of brick, rise 276 feet out of the water. The main suspension cables sagged in long, graceful swoops between the towers and were connected to the roadway by means of many smaller cables, thousands of them, that crisscrossed one another to form giant, geometric spider webs. The whole structure was stout, spooky looking and built to withstand just about anything. Philippe had us moving at well over 100 miles per hour, so it didn't take long to reach the first tower. I looked behind and noticed the absence of the 200-foot-tall lizard. He hadn't followed us onto the bridge. Whoa, slow down a little bit. He's not back there. Philippe did more than slow down. He coasted to a complete stop and parked. I see him. Staring into his side mirror, Philippe was as calm as a gunslinger. The creature was hunched over in the shadows, partially out in the open now, staring at us from near the foot of the bridge. We waited tensely for him to make a move, and he finally did. With all the stealth of a hunting jaguar, he began slinking forward. But something caught his attention and stopped him. A moment later, our less perceptive ears picked up the sound that had spooked him. Over the sound of the rain, we heard an angry rumble growing in the sky. The F-18s were back. They roared past, high above and hidden in the rain clouds. He knows it's a trap, I said. He's not going to chase us out here. I am sure he will come, Philippe replied. We killed his babies. And almost as soon as these words had left his mouth, they came true. Gojira's desire for revenge overcame his instinct for self-preservation. He erupted out of his hiding place, and with a shrill war cry, charged out onto the bridge. Philippe hit the gas and we peeled out again. Before we could get up to speed, the roadway beneath us began to jump and sway and twist. Out the rear window I watched Gojira run down the bridge on his hind legs, quickly closing in on us. We had moved barely 100 yards before he was approaching the first tower. The main suspension cables were about 85 feet apart, barely enough room for the furious giant to slip between them. But the inner cables, the thinner strands that formed the spider webs, were only about 30 feet apart. As he thundered toward the tower, he lowered his head as if he would use it as a battering ram. There is no doubt in my mind that he could have broken through the massive brick tower, but the suspension cable slowed him down before he had a chance to try. Individually, they were not strong enough to stop his progress. He barged through the first 10 or 12 of them effortlessly, but the closer he came to the tower, the more of them he had to penetrate. They slowed and then stopped his progress. Biting and kicking, he raged against the insignificant little barriers, slashing at them with his foreclaws until one of his arms became tangled up to the shoulder. With the lizard occupied, the swaying of the bridge eased up. We took advantage of the moment to shoot forward, getting most of the way to the second tower. The sight of us escaping brought his blood back to the boiling point. He screamed again and used his massive strength to shrug free of the wires, snapping them with a series of sharp cracks. He coiled his hind legs and pounced astonishingly high into the air and landed atop the tower itself. Even after all I had seen him do, this leap was utterly astonishing. With the languid, heavy grace of a big cat, he used his claws to climb over the top and leap down on the other side. That leap was probably the only serious mistake he'd made since coming to Manhattan. But it was to be his last. The cables interrupted his fall, and he crashed headfirst onto the roadway, where he found himself caught again in the semi-transparent cage of wires. The bridge shook furiously as he struggled to find his feet and continue the chase. The motion wave that came up behind us and snapped the bridge like a blanket tossed us high into the air. We landed precariously close to the edge. The cables were taking their toll on Gojira's strength. The entire bridge vibrated as he screamed out in anger and frustration. We reached the opposite side of the bridge, which was crowded with military personnel and civilians waiting to be let back into the city. We skidded to a stop and jumped out of the cab. We didn't dare go any farther and lead him into the crowds. When I looked back, the creature's head had twisted into a garrote of cables, hanging off the side of the bridge and over the river. But he still hadn't lost sight of his goal. He craned his neck in our direction and screamed. I believe he took the sight of us, standing audaciously out in the open, as a taunt, one that stoked the fires of his hatred once more. With a surge of strength, he ripped his head free. But in doing so, he stumbled backwards, entangling one of his hind legs. The noose was tightening. In the distance, we heard the F-18s coming in for another pass. In the blink of an amber eye, a quartet of warplanes dropped out of the clouds, ripping through the sky like small darts thrown at a very large target. They came in low, hugging the river, their engines roaring. The first set of guided missiles were already deployed, sailing toward the bridge. He jerked to one side, dodging the first shell, but the others connected. They slammed squarely into his chest and abdomen. Huge, bloody chunks of his body sprayed into the air, and he shrieked in pain. For the last time, he staggered to his feet and focused his eyes on our tiny figure standing below him next to our cab. He stood up, stretching to his full height, and tried to cry out in that distinctive screeching wail. But the only sound that came from his throat was a rasping moan, a gurgling death rattle. When he heard the jets coming in for their final run, he looked briefly in that direction. But a moment later, he chose to ignore them and turned his attention back to us. I think he knew it was finished. The missiles fired away from the jets and streaked toward the bridge. Gojira took a final, unsteady step in our direction before they ripped into his neck and rib cage. In quick succession, a dozen explosions carved craters deep into his tough flesh. Like a felled redwood, he leaned toward us and toppled, all 400 feet of him. The crowd of stunned New Yorkers at the foot of the bridge screamed in unison as the shape plunged toward us. Then I realized that even in death, he might still get his revenge on us. I grabbed Audrey by the arm and pulled her along, retreating. Philippe and Animal were right behind us. We turned around just as Gojira's enormous head came crashing down onto the bridge. It landed directly on top of the taxi cab, crushing it like a paper cup. I felt like rushing over to him and trying to offer him some comfort. I'd wanted to explain that we'd only done what we had to do. The Earth just wasn't big enough for both our species. But in the end, I just stood there. And then, he was dead. I would like to say one brief thing in closing. In recent years, we've discovered that the Earth's ecosystems are deeply interconnected and surprisingly fragile. We know, for example, that chemicals dumped into a river in Mexico can hurt the wine crops in Italy, or that driving to work instead of using mass transit depletes the ozone layer, which leads to more cases of skin cancer and global warming. There are hundreds of examples, but the point is, harming the environment in one part of the world can have indirect but powerful repercussions in another. That's why we all have to start taking personal responsibility for our environment. Okay, end of sermon, I promise. I couldn't be happier about how things turned out for Audrey. She's a big-time reporter now who's proving she's not a one-story wonder. She accepted a position with one of the major networks and is stationed in New York City, her new hometown. Elsie Chapman is supervising the post-mortem on Gojira and offered to take me on as part of her team. But I decided against it. Gathering and dissecting earthworms may not be as sexy as conducting the autopsy on Gojira. but ultimately, it may be more important. Many highly distinguished scientists from around the globe are volunteering to help solve the scientific riddles posed by Gojira's appearance. But only I can finish my work with the worms. By the way, one of the experts Dr. Chapman has brought in is Mendel Craven. Rumor has it that he is currently at work on a book of his own. In it, he postulates that Gojira laid a second clutch of eggs on a small island somewhere in the Caribbean Ocean before continuing his migration. I hate to say it, but the whole idea sounds rather ludicrous to me, and I don't know if anyone will be interested in reading that sort of make-believe. It wasn't long after he disappeared that I saw Philippe again. His picture started showing up on the covers of magazines, with captions like, "Is this the man who created Godzilla?" A whole series of photographs began surfacing. On the beach in Jamaica, planting a listening device on Mayor Ebert's collar and dressed as an American soldier. No one knows who took the photos. Naturally, the ministers in the French government launched an investigation into the matter, and they learned everything. When Philippe's role was made public, he was instantly declared a hero. The next day, he was fired. I got a postcard from him not long ago. It said, "Nick, now it is safe to tell everything. See you soon. P.R." Although he and his men broke quite a few international laws, we owe them a great debt. If they hadn't been willing to lay down their lives in order to destroy the nest, the rest of us would probably be spending our days scampering under rocks to avoid a growing population of gigantic reptiles. As for me, now that I've completed this project, I'll be headed back to the Ukraine to finish up my worm research. It shouldn't take long. I feel I'm close to isolating the physiochemical process causing the growth mutations, and hope to publish a paper in one of the scientific journals sometime later this year. Knowing that Audrey will be waiting for me back in the States will make those cold Ukrainian nights easier to bear. I have been having a reoccurring vision. I suppose you can even call it a waking nightmare. I'm floating through some dark place. I'm moving fast, flying down a narrow underground passageway. It could be a twisting, turning tunnel. At the far end of it, I see a shaft of light, and in that light sits a large, brown, oval shape. Zooming closer, I realize what it must be. One of Gojira's eggs. One that was laid away from the nest in a place no one would have thought to look. I am speeding closer, out of control, with no way of stopping my momentum, and just as I'm about to slam headfirst into the parasite-encrusted shell, it gurgles loudly and begins to crack open.
We hope you've enjoyed this program from Harper Audio. To order additional cassettes or to receive a complete catalog of Harper Audio and Cadman titles, please call us at 1-800-331-3761. That's 1-800-331-3761. Thank you.